Hi everyone, this is Sanjeev versus Minh, played on the 11th of May. So we got d4, knight f3, okay. Knight c6, what? What? I've spoken about this many times. The knight does not belong here, at least not yet. There's a few principles here. One, king side before queen side. Knight f6 is a far better move. Also, the fact that your opponent, that white hasn't played c4 and put immediate pressure on the center gives black this option of getting the bishop outside the pawn chain with bishop f5 and then playing e6 and letting the bishop out. This knight doesn't know where it wants to sit yet. Either, a lot of the time it goes to d7 in these openings. Firstly, because I'm from d7, it defends both c5 and e5, allowing c5 and e5 pushes, and also because often this knight here, which pretty much always goes to f6, which is the logical square since your pawn guards the e4 square, your knight wants to jump onto e4 at some point. The other knight from d7 backs up. It comes to d7, then this knight goes into here, and this knight follows it up. So yeah, it doesn't want to go to c6. It does go to c6 if this pawn ends up here. If white plays passive, you can play c5, and the knight comes in behind it, and the knight and the pawn both work together, attacking d4. Chucking a knight straight onto c6, this is not a very good idea. It's not threatening to take anything, and if your opponent plays something like c3 at some point, this knight's just garbage here. It doesn't want to go out to a5 and sit on the rim. Your opponent just plays b3, and your knight's just terrible. And the knight's it's not going to e5. It's not taking the pawn. If this pawn was here, the two working together is great. But with the knight in front of the pawn, it's awful. And if the knight does try to jump to e7 for some reason, it'll be blocking the line of the rooks and the bishop and getting in the way. So no, knight c6, no, I cannot say yes to this at all. Bishop f5 is good, knight f6 are good. These are the two moves I'd be thinking of. Bishop f5 in particular, I like this idea. Okay, so we played knight c6, and then bishop f4, yes, okay. E6, knight c, why? What is the obsession with people putting their knights on c3 and d4 openings? d4 and e4 are two very different things. In e-pawn openings, e4, e5, yeah, the four knights setup is great, but in a d-pawn opening, it's terrible. You want to push this pawn. You go back to the start of the game, and you've got e4, e5, you've got this sort of thing. This is perfectly fine. It doesn't matter this knight is here because this pawn is not going to move up without extremely weakening the king along this diagonal. And also weakening this diagonal because bishops are often sitting out here. But when you've got d4 instead, and d5, this pawn wants to move up. You're not weakening the diagonal to the queen, you're strengthening the power of the queen by letting the queen out. This pawn wants to march up and be part of the action to trade your side pawn for a center pawn, but this is not what you do in an e4 opening. So you've got to know the difference between d4 and e4. They're very, very different, and a move like this is not very good. It's just not very good at all. So bishop f4, so yeah, they're playing it like it's an e-pawn opening, which means these knights are getting into ridiculous positions. Bishop d6, does that allow your opponent to trade bishops and throw a quick fire e4 off? I'm a bit worried that he just trades it and then just goes bang e4 in the center. Probably not too big a problem since I don't know. It gives whites a decent play by the looks of it. This knight, which was garbage, is now a good knight. And if your opponent plays something like this, they've just got a terrible bishop for the rest of the game. So, yeah, going back here, playing e6 on this move just traps the bishop in, which is completely unnecessary. Why not get the bishop outside the pawn chain first? Like knight g4 or knight f5, and then play e6. Why would you just give yourself a rubbish bishop for the rest of the game? Okay, so e6, I think a bad move, followed by knight c3, another bad move. Bishop d6, I think knight f6 first probably need to be played just to stop e4 and white justifying his bad knight placement. He's played bishop d6. Now here, white should probably either take the bishop or play back to g3. The engine's saying bishop g5, but I think that's just a wasted move. Why would the bishop go to f4 and then g5? Back to g3 is fine. You're not worried about your opponent taking the bishop because that just opens up the h-file for this rook. And just trading is fine as well. Trading off your bad bishop for his good bishop. Just take the bishop and then go e3 is fine. But playing e3 here is a mistake. It lets black just take it, which he did, which is correct, and takes back. And now this pawn is very uncomfortably placed. I mean, it does put a bind on the e5 square, but this is going to be a target for quite some time. It's just a shame this knight is on such an absurd square. Yeah, because this pawn would like to go to c6 and the queen go to c7 to harass this pawn. Okay, knight g e7. Why not knight f6? Why does it want to go to e7? Like you got this center pawn on d5, which means it supports this wonderful e4 square, which would be the perfect place to chuck a knight. I don't know why your knights would want to be in this configuration. This knight is rubbish as it is, and now you've just taken away a good square from this knight with the other knight. And where's this knight actually going? Maybe it's going to f5 to put pressure on here. This knight wants to move here because it doesn't want to stay on c3, which is a rubbish square. It probably wants to, you probably maybe want to pin this knight and then play knight e2 and then play c3. So yeah, some really strange piece placements by these players. And neither one of them is getting an advantage because they're both putting their pieces on strange squares that don't cooperate. So bishop d3 was played now, just developing the bishop. That could be followed up with knight e2 maybe. A bit worried about bishop here because it does allow moves like knight here and trading off the rubbish knight for a really nice bishop. So I really think maybe pinning it might have been a better option. So I'm not a big fan of that. Maybe just queen d2 and castling long is the way to go. Yeah, because you don't really want to castle kingside, I don't think. You're going to be forced to play g3 at some point, and all these holes are going to be a massive problem. They're not too big a problem because this bishop is awful, trapped in by his own pawns. So, yeah, this is just a positional nightmare. Both players are just not really thinking too carefully about long-term plans and where their pieces want to be 10 moves from now. And that's the thing. You look at the pawn structure, and from the pawn structure, you should be able to work out that a knight wants to be sitting here with another knight supporting it, either on d6 or f6. Maybe a knight wants to go to f5, but it would be this knight that wants to go to f5, not this knight. F5 and e5 or something. This bishop, I have no idea what this bishop's going to be doing for the whole game. This knight's almost better off here, so you can play b6 and play bishop a6 and trade off your terrible bishop for your opponent's bishop, in which case bringing this knight out in the first place was very bad. So yeah, crazy. Okay, let's just plow through it. Castles. Knight g6. G6 hits the f pawn. So does this knight want to go back to e2, or does this bishop just want to chop this knight off straight away? It's a tricky situation. Chopping the knight off straight away has a lot of merit to it. Because after this, then a move like g3 is great. There's no way this bishop's getting in these holes. You got two pawns guarding e5. Black is never ever freeing this bishop up. So after takes, you'd want to take with the h pawn, taking towards the center, but more importantly, not giving yourself a horrible backward pawn that's going to lose you the game. That gets rid of that bishop, and now this knight needs to find somewhere to go, which is tricky. Yeah. If you don't trade it, you have to play g3, and g3 is not too bad. With knights here and here, though, the plan of f6, e5 might be a thing. Might. It's just so easy to chuck rooks on the e-file and stop this sort of thing from happening, though. White still does have to solve the problem of the terrible placed knight. G6, what about f5? I mean, you don't want to play it yet, obviously. Your opponent will mess up your pawn structure. It's just so hard to find good places for these pieces. Okay, knight g6, we'll just consider that okay for now. Queen e2 looks like a very big blunder. Yes, it just throws away a pawn. It doesn't deal with the problem. Knight there threatens to win a pawn. And he just runs straight in and throws away a pawn. I mean, queen d2 is a little bit better if you want to get this queen out. But what about just g3? And there's these light squared weaknesses aren't a problem because this bishop's not getting into them, and this knight is not getting into them either. You know, it's perfectly fine to do this if there's no way for your opponent to take advantage of these light squared weaknesses. And with an encased bishop and a rubbish knight, there's no way on earth White's in any danger by playing a move like this. So queen e2, just terrible, just throws away a pawn, and the queen moves again, and then the knight grabs a bishop, which is great. Yeah, good take back with the queen, didn't give himself double pawns. And now black, how does black play this now? He has to get this knight off this terrible square. Ideally it wants to get to e4, but how do you get it there? How do you get to f6? How do you get to f6 by d7? Maybe knight b8. Knight b8 to d7 to f6 to e4 or something. I mean, it's not going to jump into e4, but it wants to guard e4. So what did he play? He played queen f6. Yeah, I mean, I guess the knight can then go to here and then to here, and then put pressure on here. Okay, queen f6 I'm okay with. I think. It's just hard to tell. h4, it looks like White's trying to plant a knight on g5 and do some checkmating stuff on Black's king, but there's no way on earth that Black is going to fall for this. You know, Min's not going to fall for stuff like this. I think h4 is just weakening the king and weakening your pawn structure in general. If there was a rook behind it, if this king wasn't castled yet and the rook was still on h1, h4 would be actually a very strong attacking move. But with the king castle on this side, I think it's just weakening. Because, you know, after the knight ultimately gets to g5, g6 is going to be played. And being able to answer with h5 afterwards, you know, with a h-pawn hack is great. But there's no follow-up. After the knight jumps into here in g6, White doesn't have a way to follow that up. And the pawn sitting on h4, maybe you can play rook here, rook lift. I don't know. I really think White should be playing in the center here, trying to get c4 in and put pressure on the center. Even that looks a bit dodgy because it leaves this pawn isolated and weak. What is White's plan? I would say White should just be looking to plant a knight in e5 for now. Just chuck the knight in there and work out the rest later. Rook f e1 to defend the e5 square. Stop Black from getting e5 in himself. Not that he can do it with the knight hacking away at here, but just give it extra defense so the knight can jump in here at the right time. Or maybe even this rook jumping out to here, rook a here. And the basic idea is to plant a knight into here, and your rook stays on f1 because you're planning to go f4 and then eventually f5. Though how you're going to get f5 in with a bishop on this line is a bit tricky. You need this knight to somehow support this push. So maybe knight e2 to g3. This knight sits in e5, and this pawn runs its way up to f5. Maybe that's the way that White should handle this. Okay, he didn't though. He went h4, and with a pawn on h4 now, that's less defense for the king. It makes the whole f4, f5 plan even worse. Because you might need to have this pawn on h3 to support g4, so that you can eventually get f5 in. So it's a bit tricky. Okay, so rook fd8. Rook, why? What's the rook doing there? Okay, okay, so I think I see why. He's defending the d5 pawn so he can eventually get e5 in. That seems to be the idea, so the bishop can eventually come out. The problem with this is after you push this pawn, won't this d pawn be on pre from both the queen and the knight? So that's a big issue. That's a major problem to deal with. And there's a secondary problem of what if this knight just jumps out to b5 and harasses the c6 pawn? Are you going to play rook d7, blocking your own bishop in to defend it? Maybe the queen's dropping back to here. I'm not sure. But then it runs into pressure down the e-file. It's better than no plan at all, but surely it's better to have this rook here and have the other rook on the e-file. So when you push e5, you've got a rook behind it, so you're opening the rook file. You really want a pawn on c6 defending d5 while you play this. But of course, if there's a pawn on c6, there's no knight on c6. The knight needs to be on d7, with the pawn on c6 and then the rook on e8 supporting this push, or doubled rooks on e7 and e8 supporting e5. So some pretty big rearranging required in order to make this work. In the meantime, this bishop has nowhere to go. If only it was outside the pawn chain, huh? Maybe a6, which keeps the knight out of b5, and then playing b6 and bishop b7 is the way to go. But then why go for the e5 plan at all? Why not go for a c5 plan? Yeah, it's hard to tell, but I don't think this is going to work out too well. So now, you know, white should just put an extra defender on the d pawn, probably rook here, or maybe just knight back here. Get the knight out of the way, though it's going to interfere with rooks trying to defend along the e-file, which is a bit of a problem. Rook here comes to mind as a potentially good move. Maybe this knight, maybe knight to here is a possibility. Hitting the pawn, and then c6 can be played, keeping this pawn defended so the rook can come to here, and then the knight from b5 can go to here, to here, to here, and then from here it can guard f5, allowing an eventual f5 push. I don't know, I'm throwing plans out there for you to think about, but this is how a good player would think about this position. They would look at every single possible plan and arrangement and look at all of black's possible different plans and arrangements, and then work out from that which is the most flexible and which is the best. Knight g5 is just, yeah, I don't know. Now there's a problem of defending this pawn here. Knight here once again probably needs to be played. Maybe the knight just needs to run back, because you need to keep pieces defending e5. You need to stop black from playing e5 yourself. I don't think the knight should have jumped into g5 in the first place. For that matter, the pawn shouldn't have run up to h4 in the first place. This knight's needed here. It's defending the d pawn and defending the e5 square. Okay, so given that all this has happened, he now needs to defend this. So, I mean, rook a d1 comes to mind, just giving an extra defender to this here. Or knight e2, giving an extra defender, ready to play c6 and defend all this. We have got a problem in that e5 is coming pretty soon. Maybe, yeah, just rook here is the way to go. So that way e5 can be answered by taking on e5, and then maybe taking on e5. It's a tricky one. How do you stop e5 and keep your d pawn defended at the same time? The only way to do that is just run the knight back. Okay, he played f4, which, oh gosh, no, black just takes the pawn and swaps the queens off. This is game over. Black is now 2 pawns up, and white's just thrown away 2 pawns for nothing this game. Black's still got an absolutely awful bishop, but now it can start thinking about getting out. And the 2 pawns that black is up are both center pawns, keeping everything under control. White's got nothing now. There's really no way for white to come back from here. He played rook a d1, just throwing away a 3rd pawn. He has to defend this pawn. You know, rook f2 maybe, defend the pawn that way. And then the rook can, you know, maybe double at some point, or double on the f-file. Maybe you've got g4, f5 if you can ever maneuver this knight round to here to help out. Something like that is the way to go. But yeah, just throwing away a pawn, that is not it. Yeah, this is just free pawns galore. White just doesn't like pawns. Okay, so rook f2 hits the knight. Knight goes back to b4. a3 hits the knight again. Aren't you just chasing the knight to where it wants to go? I guess the threat was pawn up and then steal another pawn, but yeah. The knight probably wants to jump to a6 now, where it can go to c5. And if white plays b4, you can play c5 anyway. He went back to c6. I mean, that looks like the safe move. I think I prefer a6, because you know, if b4 is played to keep knights out of here, you can answer with stuff like this. Black still has to deal with the bishop problem though. He played c6, knight went into b5. There's another reason why a6 is better, because knight b5 harasses the c pawn. And yeah, rook d7 is not a very comfortable move with this bishop trapped in. I'm just looking at the moves ahead. It looks like black found a decent answer to this, basically saying you send your knight in, it's trapped. The knight ran in, and then rook a7, and the threat is b5, just winning a piece, or b6, just winning a piece. How does white save his piece? Rook c2, obviously. That's got to be it. Either rook c2 or rook c1. So the pawn can't move because the knight is... because this knight will be on pre, and rook just takes knight, defending his knight. He didn't know. He played rook f2 and just gave up a whole piece. So b5 was played, and now that's it. He's just lost the knight. Yeah, no, that just loses a whole piece. Rook c2, rook takes c7, rook c1, bishop b7, and yeah, just easy win for black from here. We don't really need to analyze many of the rest of the game. Unless there's another major blunder. Okay, threat of taking this. Oh, was there a major blunder? f5, knight c5. How do you stop the knight fork and save your knight at the same move? f5 looks like a blunder to me. Surely just like, can you, no, you can't really double. Maybe, yeah, there's knight into here, which is a problem as well. So how does black safely navigate this position without anything terrible happening? That's the question. This knight's defended. Can you just run this rook back here? You know, like this. Is that just a safe way to navigate the position? The idea is just move the knight next move and then trade everything off. Something like that. H6 was definitely not a good move, I don't think. Well, just the engine likes H6 for some reason. I'm not sure why. I mean, can't you just double your rooks? Or is there a problem with that move? I mean, the idea is simple. After knight moves, you just move your knight. Going right back, I don't know if d4 was a good move. This pawn is perfectly fine on d5, protected by a pawn. Nice pawn chain here. Surely you just break the pin. You just play something like this. And then move the knight. Oh, you can't move the knight. They're doubled. So you got to find some way to break this pin. Maybe this rook comes back here. That's the way to do it. Yeah. And the basic idea is you just move the knight defending your rook, and then everything swaps off on the c-file, and black wins from a whole extra piece and a piece and 2 pawns up. So that's what black should have been concentrating on. How do I break this pin, allowing myself to safely move the knight and swap everything off? Alternatively, you just simply get your rook off this line. I say bishop b7, g4. Can you just play rook here instead? Well, that allows rook for 2 pieces, but that, yeah, you probably don't want that because then you only need the exchange up, not a whole piece up. So yeah, rook c8. That'd be the way. But that's what black's work should have been based on in this position. How do I break this pin and simplify everything off on the c file? And he wasn't doing it. In this position, he's gone d4, which yeah, is quite makes this pawn a little bit overextended and hard to defend. And after rook d2, maybe we can. There's a problem because now the d pawn's moved. This e4 square is available, allowing moves like knight f6 with knight fork. So we can't just double our rooks on this file and then, yeah, because we're running straight into this, allowing a knight fork. So it's quite tricky. And h6 just chased the knight to where it wanted to go. f5 once again chasing the knight to where it wanted to go. Now the threat of just taking the bishop and getting your piece back, and also taking this pawn with a knight fork. It's a problem. Now knight a5 was played, and that's using tactics to stop tactics. The idea is if the knight takes on e6, this rook takes here with check, and then this rook gets to safety. So well done to black finding that tactic there to save his position. What if b4 just gets played though? Isn't this a massive problem for white to deal with? No, it's not. He's got more tactics. Lucky for him, the rook can take the knight, and after takes back either with the rook or the pawn, we've got knight here with a knight fork. So yeah, black. I don't know. I don't know if he saw all that. If he did calculate all that out, well done. If he didn't, you are very, very lucky. That's all I can say, because you're playing some pretty. You're sort of just letting white get his knight to wonderful places. Okay, so the knight took on b7, allowed rook takes rook check, and then he just loses a whole extra rook. And the rest of this game is kind of unimportant. it's kind of irrelevant what happens. This is just, yeah, he just trades everything off and just does a rook and knight up and a pawn up and two pawns up, sorry. And at this point, white just resigned. His king is trapped on the back, and there's nothing he can do. Black's just going to queen a pawn and win. Okay, yeah, sorry to be very negative this game, and I was very negative, but yeah, I think both players need to really have a long, close look at this game and examine closely their decisions on where they place their pieces in the opening, because there seem to be no long-term planning, no thoughts about where do these pieces want to be 10 moves from now. And that's something you have to be thinking about when you're playing your openings. You have to be thinking very carefully about where your pieces ultimately want to end up and what they're, what they're going to be doing. Right from the very start of the game, as early as move 2, I'm already criticizing this knight move because this knight has no freedom. It has no future. It's not doing anything. It's actually hurting black on this square. It stops c6 with an excellent defensive move. It stops c5 with pressure on the center, and later on it's going to have no scope at all. It's not going to want to go to any of these squares, and it's going to have to move again, where it either undevelops, it goes to the back line interfering with the action of the two rooks, or it goes here interfering with the action of the bishop. So it's straight away I have to criticize a move like this. It's just not a very good move. And similarly, there were a lot of moves that White played. White bringing his knight here, it was the same sort of thing. The knight would be much better placed here, where it can follow this knight in, or after going to c3 after the pawn has gone to c4, where it can work with the pawn to attack the center. Okay, so I hope everyone watching has learned something from this, and thanks for listening. I'll see you later.